November 24th, 1326. The market square of Hereford, England, is packed shoulder to shoulder with people. Nobles wrapped in heavy cloaks, priests clutching their rosaries, merchants and peasants alike, have all come for the same purpose: to watch a grim display of public justice. Towering above the throng stands a wooden scaffold. At its center, soldiers drag forward a man in his early 40s. His face is hollow, his skin pale. For days he has refused food, clinging to the faint hope that starvation might spare him from what lies ahead. His once splendid garments now hang in filthy rags from his gaunt frame. Not long ago, this very man stood second only to the king in power, his influence unrivaled across England. Today, he is moments away from meeting one of the most savage deaths ever staged in the kingdom. His name is Hugh Despenser the Younger, royal favorite, and many whispered, the lover of King Edward II. Within hours, his body will be mutilated before a roaring crowd, a savage warning to all who reach too close to the throne without guarding their backs. But how did Hugh come to this scaffold? To understand his ruin, we must rewind. His rise and ultimately his fall is a tale drenched in ambition, ruthless politics, betrayal, and scandal that shook the very foundations of the realm. Hugh Despenser the Younger was born around 1286 into one of the most powerful noble families in England. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had served King Edward I loyally. His mother, Isabel Beauchamp, descended from the prestigious Earl of Warwick's line. From birth, Hugh held every advantage a young aristocrat could hope for: noble status, a refined education, and open doors to the royal court. From the start, his destiny was clear: to serve the crown and secure his family's influence. Everything shifted in 1307 when Edward II ascended the throne. Edward carried a reputation that raised suspicions among the nobility. His affections for male companions were well known, and his first great favorite, Piers Gaveston, sparked outrage across the kingdom. Gaveston was more than just close to the king. He was brazen, arrogant, openly dismissive of the great lords, and shameless in flaunting his power. Resentment swelled until it erupted. By 1312, the barons had had enough. Gaveston was seized and executed without mercy, and a dangerous vacuum opened beside the king. Hugh Despenser was waiting to fill it. By 1316, Hugh had secured his place within Edward's inner circle. Appointed royal chamberlain, he enjoyed constant access to the king's private chambers. Their relationship deepened rapidly. To fortify his status further, Hugh married Eleanor de Clare, the king's niece. Through this union, he inherited the rich lordship of Glamorgan in Wales, but wealth and position only whetted Hugh's appetite. He craved more land, more power, more control, and with the king's affection shielding him, there seemed no limit. He exploited his access shamelessly, seizing estates across England and Wales. He twisted the law to dispossess rivals, even stripping property from widows and his own in-laws. He acted openly, brazenly, and without a shred of restraint. His enemies multiplied quickly. By 1321, the barons had reached their breaking point. Enraged by Hugh's corruption and unchecked greed, they revolted. Hugh was banished into exile. Yet he refused to disappear quietly. From abroad, he turned to piracy, yes, piracy, raiding English merchant ships as if to prove he would never submit. Still, Hugh's absence didn't last. In 1322, Edward crushed the baronial rebellion and regained control of the kingdom. With his patron restored, Hugh returned harder, hungrier, and more ruthless than ever before. From 1322 to 1326, the Despensers, father and son, did not merely serve the king. They ruled with him. Hugh the Younger monopolized access to Edward, steered royal policy, and wielded authority as though the crown itself belonged to him. Chronicler Jean Froissart would later write that Hugh was king in everything but name, and he wasn't far from the truth. Yet alongside his political dominance came dangerous whispers. Rumors spread that Hugh's relationship with Edward was not only political, but intimate. Hugh had a wife and children, yes, but many at court believed he was also the king's lover. In medieval England, such a charge was perilous. Same-sex relationships were condemned as sodomy, a grievous sin in the eyes of the church and a crime against the divine order. Whether true or not scarcely mattered. The gossip alone was poison, further blackening Hugh's name and stoking the flames of his eventual downfall. Among Hugh's fiercest enemies was none other than Queen Isabella, Edward II's wife. The daughter of the French king, Isabella had once enjoyed real influence at court, but Hugh systematically stripped that away. Over time, he cut her out of decision-making, drained her access to funds, and even interfered with her role as a mother. By 1324, Hugh went too far. He seized Isabella's estates, imprisoned her household servants, and, most shockingly of all, removed her children from her care, placing them instead under the custody of his own wife, Eleanor. For Isabella, this humiliation was the final blow. The very next year, 1325, she was dispatched to France to negotiate a peace treaty on Edward's behalf, but she had no intention of merely serving as her husband's envoy. In Paris, she encountered Roger Mortimer, a formidable English baron who had once languished in the Tower of London after clashing with Hugh, only to escape into exile. The Queen and Mortimer soon became lovers and allies in a bold conspiracy to topple Edward and destroy the Despensers forever. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer returned to English soil. Their military force was small, a modest band of mercenaries, but they didn't need numbers. The kingdom was primed for revolt. Nobles, long embittered by Hugh's greed and Edward's blind devotion, rallied to Isabella's banner almost instantly. Support for the king collapsed like a rotting wall. Panic spread. Edward, Hugh, and the elder Despenser fled westward, dragging the royal treasury behind them. But their escape was already doomed. One by one, allies deserted. Lords who once feigned loyalty turned on them. The people themselves rose in rebellion. Father and son split apart, hoping to avoid capture. Hugh the elder, a seasoned veteran clad in armor, made his way to Bristol, but his flight ended quickly. Local forces seized him, and his execution was swift and merciless. Still wearing his armor, he was hanged without ceremony. His head was hacked off, his body quartered, and the remains tossed aside, scavenged by dogs. A brutal end for a man who had faithfully served two English kings. Meanwhile, Edward and Hugh the Younger pressed deeper into Wales, desperate to escape the tightening noose. But everywhere they turned, the walls closed in. Starved of allies, pursued by their enemies, the fugitives were finally captured near Neath. The mighty King of England was taken prisoner, stripped of his crown within weeks, and forced to yield his throne to his 14-year-old son, the future Edward III. But Hugh's fate would be far darker than Edward's. Knowing what awaited him, Hugh tried to embrace death on his own terms. He stopped eating, wasting away in a desperate attempt to die before his captors could exact vengeance. Yet even this escape eluded him. By mid-November, he was still alive, skeletal and weak, dragged back over the border to Hereford. On November 24th, he stood before his enemies, Queen Isabella, Roger Mortimer, and a tribunal of barons who had suffered under his tyranny. The so-called trial was nothing but a performance. The verdict had been decided long before his capture. The charges read out were lengthy: treason, extortion, corruption, abuse of royal favor, theft of lands. The barons cloaked their vengeance in legal trappings, ensuring the proceedings resembled justice rather than sheer retaliation. But everyone watching knew better. Hugh Despenser the Younger had been condemned from the start. That morning, the marketplace at Hereford overflowed with bodies. Townsfolk, soldiers, nobles, and even peasants from nearby villages pressed in shoulder to shoulder, eager for the spectacle. For them, this was not just an execution. It was theater, punishment wrapped in symbolism, and a rare chance to see a man who had wielded enormous power brought to ruin. Queen Isabella herself was present, as was Roger Mortimer, watching from the front as their hated rival was delivered to the scaffold. The ritual humiliation began at once. Hugh was bound to a tall ladder so that the crowd could see him from every angle. Onto his head, the executioners forced a crown made of stinging nettles, a bitter parody of the influence he had once enjoyed at Edward's side. Lines from the Bible condemning arrogance and wickedness were smeared across his bare skin, a mock sermon for all to read. Then came the torment. Chroniclers such as Jean Froissart described the horror in chilling detail. First, Hugh's genitals were hacked away and cast into a fire before his eyes, a brutal punishment designed to condemn and ridicule the rumors of sodomy with King Edward. The crowd roared, some jeering, others laughing, many cheering with savage satisfaction. But this was only the beginning. Still alive, Hugh was cut open. His belly was slit, and his intestines were slowly drawn out, then tossed onto the flames. Witnesses said the sound he made was not like a human cry at all, but an unearthly howl of pain and terror. It was the sound of a man torn apart while still conscious. The agony stretched out deliberately for the crowd's approval. At last, after what must have felt like an eternity, Hugh was hanged. Yet even in death, humiliation followed. His head was struck from his body and his corpse was quartered. The pieces were dispatched to cities across the realm, grim warnings nailed up in public squares and at gates. His head was fixed atop London's gates, where all who entered the capital would see the price of greed and overreaching ambition. But this was more than vengeance. It was ceremony. Every detail of Hugh's execution carried meaning. His mutilation was meant not only to punish but to cleanse, to dramatize before the people the destruction of corruption, arrogance, and forbidden sin. His death was crafted to be a lesson as much as a spectacle. Even after Hugh's body was scattered, the shadow of his downfall lingered. 4 years later, in 1330, his widow, Eleanor de Clare, was finally granted permission to collect what little remained of him. By then there was almost nothing left to bury. A severed head, a thigh bone, a handful of broken fragments. That was all that could be laid to rest. It was a pitiful grave for a man who had once ruled England from behind the throne. As for Edward II, his fate was scarcely better. Stripped of his crown, he was kept in confinement. In September 1327, less than a year after Hugh's horrific death, the former king perished at Berkeley Castle under circumstances that remain clouded in mystery. The most notorious tale claims he was murdered with a red-hot poker thrust into his rectum, a killing that left no external wounds but carried grim symbolism. The method tied directly to the rumors of his intimacy with Hugh, twisting scandal into execution. Whether this account is true or not, the persistence of the story shows how deeply humiliation and cruelty shaped their legacy. For Hugh, his execution had never been only about punishment. It was about obliteration. His body was torn apart, his remains burned and scattered, his memory reduced to shame. He had become the embodiment of excess, corruption, and forbidden desire. To his enemies, it was not enough to destroy him. They needed to erase what he represented: his greed, his hold over the king, and the scandalous whispers that had haunted their court. And yet, the wheel of power did not stop turning. The very architects of Hugh's destruction would soon face the same fate. In 1330, Edward III, only 17 years old, seized control of his own crown. Roger Mortimer, who had ruled in the Queen's name, was arrested. Though spared Hugh's drawn-out torment, he was hanged as a traitor. Isabella herself, once triumphant, was stripped of authority and confined under house arrest. Her moment of glory proved brief, swallowed up by the same unforgiving cycle of power and betrayal. Nearly 7 centuries later, the story of Hugh Despenser still unsettles and fascinates. In modern surveys, he has been ranked the greatest villain of the 14th century, overshadowing even monarchs and generals. His name surfaces in plays, novels, and television dramas, where he is cast as the perfect schemer, ambitious, arrogant, and destined to fall. Yet modern historians caution against taking every accusation at face value. Hugh was ruthless, yes. He amassed wealth on a staggering scale, dispossessed rivals, and used Edward's favor to dominate court politics. His enemies multiplied precisely because he showed little restraint or mercy. Still, not every charge leveled against him was grounded in truth. In 14th century politics, branding someone a sodomite was less about their private life and more about weaponizing shame. The medieval world treated sexuality not only as a moral concern but as a political tool. By accusing Hugh and Edward of an illicit relationship, their enemies undermined their legitimacy, fueled public outrage, and provided moral justification for their removal. Whether the rumors reflected reality hardly mattered. The scandal itself was enough to ruin them. In this way, homophobia became a convenient blade, one that cut reputations apart while leaving little room for defense. Hugh's end also reveals the theatrical side of medieval justice. Executions were never merely about ending a life. They were staged performances, each step layered with symbolism. Castration condemned the supposed sin. Burning entrails symbolized cleansing corruption. Beheading and quartering displayed the power of the realm, scattering both body and legacy. To kill a man like Hugh was not sufficient. His body had to be transformed into a message broadcast across the kingdom. That message was stark. This is the fate of anyone who overreaches, who manipulates royal power for selfish ends, who dares to mix private desires with public authority. And yet, perhaps the most unsettling part of Hugh's story is how familiar it feels. Even today, we witness the rise and fall of elites, leaders elevated by power and favoritism, only to be torn down under the weight of scandal or ambition. We still see sexuality wielded as a weapon in politics, not as a matter of truth, but as a tool of destruction. The spectacle may no longer be in a medieval square, but the dynamics remain strikingly similar. Hugh Despenser's life is chilling, not only because of its brutality, but because of its echoes across time. He rose quickly, lifted by privilege, cunning, and the affection of a king. He flew higher than almost anyone else of his era. And when he fell, his destruction was staged for maximum effect. It was not merely a political defeat, but a public drama carved into flesh, played out before thousands, and remembered for centuries. From a privileged noble child to the shadow ruler of England, from royal chamberlain to mutilated traitor, Hugh's journey is one of the most violent and revealing chapters in English history. His name, long buried, still conjures unease. His bones were scattered, his body erased. Yet his story endures as a mirror of the darker sides of politics, sexuality, and vengeance. In the end, his fate was a lesson as much as it was a punishment. It warned that power is never secure, that ambition without allies breeds destruction, and that once scandal takes hold, it can consume both man and legacy. The cruel theater of his death reminds us that history is not only written in chronicles, but also in symbols, in spectacle, and in warnings shouted across generations. Nearly 700 years later, Hugh Despenser the Younger still whispers his caution. Power always comes at a price, and history never forgets.